Probably coming. We started recording. Sorry that we're just kind of jumping from one thing to another. Let me just introduce our Mind Core Fellow who's going to be moderating this session. His name is Andrea Beltrama, and that's all I'm going to say. I'm just going to turn it over to him, and then my face will become small. One point for our attendees, feel free to post any questions you have for our speakers in the chat. And to our panelists, if you see a question while somebody else is speaking, you think you can just answer it on the fly, you're welcome to answer it there. That happened during the first panel, and that was pretty useful. Otherwise, if I can post an answer, that will be helpful. I will. I did not know I posted the wrong thing for SQL in the last thing. But anyway, enough of me. I'm turning it over. Andrea, take it away. Thank you.
Hi. Well, thanks, Heather. Thanks for organizing this wonderful event. So we are now starting the communicating science to the public part of our Beyond Academia Paths event today at MindCore. And so, as I say, my name is Andrea Beltrama. I'm a MindCore postdoc, working mostly in linguistics here at the University of Pennsylvania. And I'm very excited to introduce our two experts and speakers that will keep us company for the next hour. So we have Jayatri Das, Chief Bioscientist at the Franklin Institute, and Julie Sedevi, a writer and language scientist. So before we start, just a reminder, feel free to put your questions in the chat as the conversation moves on. I'll do my best to read them. Heather will help me out too. So we want to make this as interactive as possible, and especially having only two people now, I think it'll be easy to fit in more questions to keep the conversation, in a conversation that we did in the previous panel. So I think as we've been doing throughout the day, I will just ask our two speakers to briefly introduce themselves and very briefly say something about what, their work and what they do. I mean, we have the full bios available, so there's no need to go into detail, but I just thought that as a starting point, we'll start with a brief introduction, and then we'll move on and have a nice and informative conversation. So, Jayatri, you might want to start. I'm totally different.
Sure.
You want to start, and we can keep it as interactive as possible.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks to everybody for sticking around here at 3:30 on a Friday afternoon. So I am the Chief Bioscientist and Director of Science Content at the Franklin Institute. And as my quick intro, I'll just kind of cover that my role focuses on kind of three different aspects of what we do at the museum. My role as Chief Bioscientist is really public facing. So I do a lot of public communication of science, particularly in the life sciences, to audiences of all ages, across platforms. Then from the Director of Science Content perspective, I kind of have two different back of house roles. One is to serve as kind of point of review for pretty much science content across the board, whether it's exhibits, whether it's programs, whether it's digital content. And then the other piece is doing a lot of partnership work about science communication. So some of that is working with other folks in science communication across local and national networks. But some of it is also doing science communication training for scientists like you. So that's kind of a very quick overview of the buckets of work that I do, and we can definitely get into more detail.
Thanks, Jayatri. I was so excited to see that you were joining this panel because it was kind of my alternative fantasy life to have the kind of job that you have. So I don't have such a snazzy background. My background is my private writer's studio here. I'll tell you just a little bit about how I got to this room where I do a lot of my work. I actually spent a dozen years as a full-time faculty member at Brown University. And I hear a lot of people talking about the difficulties of academic life or ways that they think that life isn't suited for them. I have to say that I really loved my academic job. I did not leave out of misery. I think everything that happened within that life, more or less, was good, was working for me. The big problem for me, I think, was what it didn't let in, because it's such a consuming kind of work that I realized that there was not going to be much room in my life for some of the other things that I felt were important to me. So at some point, while on sabbatical and while working on a book, I kind of revisited the sense that I'd had way at the beginning of my journey into language sciences, which is that I came to linguistics out of a love for language. And I had originally started college as an English major, thinking that I was going to be a novelist because I loved working with the medium of language. And then the science of language totally captivated me, and off I went in that track. And I just felt that this was something that I really wanted to develop, and that it's not something that I was going to be able to do. You know, I had this illusion that once I got tenure, I would be able to indulge in some of my writing activities. It doesn't work that way. You get more busy after tenure, not less busy. In some ways, life is less scary after tenure, but it certainly doesn't free up time. So at that point, I began to transition out of academia. And now at this point, I spend most of my time almost entirely, I am entirely self-employed. So I maintain an adjunct appointment at the University of Calgary, where I moved when I left Brown. And I teach very occasionally now, and only when I want, what I want. And other than that, I've been working a lot on book length projects. I've got a textbook that's now in its second edition, and 2 books on language for non-academic audiences, and then an entirely literary book. It's a collection of literary essays that I co-edited. And I'm working on another book that kind of fuses literary essays together with the science of language. So that's really kind of a marriage of those 2 sides of things. My income stream is really varied. So if you're someone who likes a predictable life, the life I lead is not for you. My income will vary dramatically year to year, and it comes from a mix of royalties, workshop fees, fees for writing short pieces for magazines, occasionally speaking fees. I do some editing as well, which is a nice way of kind of building some background, more steady income. And it's really a patchwork. The plus side is I have an enormous amount of freedom, and we can talk a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Those are incredibly interesting stories. And I think there's a lot of ways one could follow up. And in fact, I already see a question coming in the chat. I also think that because of the particular nature of this panel, I think it's probably great, in fact, to even tailor question to a particular speaker here, as opposed to what was happening before. So, so we have a question from Jayatri that says, I see that you did a postdoc. How necessary is this for the type of position you have now?
That's a great question. And Julie, what you were saying about the fact that it's not that academia was bad, it wasn't enough. that really resonated with me, because I actually really love doing research. But just a quick bit of a tangent about my transition, because I think that'll set up the context for the postdoc. I was pretty much convinced I was going to pursue a career in academia until my last year in grad school. And as I was finishing up, I did my PhD in evolutionary biology, as you can tell from my bio, but there was a trial in Dover, Pennsylvania, which is just about a little west of here, about the teaching of evolution in schools. And a group of parents and the ACLU had sued the Dover area school district because the school district had mandated that their science teachers read a statement in science classes that evolution was just a theory. And the press coverage around this trial included, all of this information about the lack of understanding or lack of belief, whatever you want to call it, in evolutionary biology among Americans. And that was such an eye-opener for me, is that, here I am in the lab in my little bubble, studying these questions that are of, such personal fascination to me. But there is this, but why am I doing this? And I had done outreach for fun throughout my career. And as I looked around me, I saw that there were lots of other people who were good at research, but not a lot of people who were good at talking about science. So I felt like there was a strength that I had that was, somewhat unique. And so I had actually already lined up a postdoc. So I, I did a fellowship at the National Academy of Sciences in between, which I can also talk about. But to answer the question directly, I wouldn't have thought that my postdoc was necessary for what I did. But it turns out that the position that I applied for at the museum was a senior level position. And obviously at that point, I had very minimal actual museum experience. And so having the postdoc was a way for the HR department to justify hiring me into a senior position because it counted as having had a job, whereas PhD only counted as school. So it mattered in a way that was a little bit of a technicality.
Thanks. And actually, the person, I forgot to mention, the question was asked by Jessica Wojcik. We have a very similar question, so I would like to involve Julie now. A question by Laura Zaneski that asked, do you need a PhD to pursue a career in science communication, and what kind of jobs are there in science communication? So I guess this also touches on this theme of what type of background, what type of education, what type of prerequisites do we need to have for this type of career. So I think, I would love to hear what Julie has to say about this.
So I think this is a field that people get into at varying levels and from various sources with a mix of different skills. So certainly I know of some high-level science communicators who have a bachelor's, maybe a master's degree in some scientific field, and then a degree in science journalism. So there's a growing number of universities now that offer a degree or a certificate in science communications. So the degree is typically a master's degree that will kind of march you through, all of the training that you get for journalism with a specific bent towards science. Science certificates, science communication certificates are really geared for people who are maybe already professionals in some field and who want to augment their skill sets. So there's a recognition that people from a variety of different backgrounds can contribute in this way, and a number of ways to enter. I also know of people who just kind of, from whatever background they had, whether it was a science degree as an undergrad or a master's degree, simply began writing for scientific outlets and began to build up a portfolio that way, and don't necessarily have a degree that marks them as a specialist in science communication. I think that's still possible to do. There's more and more, I think that field is becoming professionalized. So I think nowadays you'd be competing with people who have maybe a little bit more formal training or a PhD in a scientific field, but I think it's still possible to enter simply by building up a portfolio of work that is impressive.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And just to kind of put the landscape for museums out there are actually very few museums that have positions for PhD level scientists. Some of them are natural history museums that actually have research scientists on staff. But as far as like science museums and science centers goes, it's really kind of the big museums that are working at the interface with research scientists that need PhD level scientists on staff. Most museums are really tailoring their science to kind of K-12 audiences and families. And they're just not doing the level of science education that requires having somebody with that kind of advanced degree on staff.
Thanks. And actually, I kind of want to take advantage of this to ask a question about that. I'd just love to hear both of your perspective of this. And it's kind of more of a higher level question, but as someone who's a postdoc now, at least in my discipline, but I would say in I guess most fields, what we experience that the more we know about something, the more confused we get. Things get more complicated, and then things becomes even harder to explain. And there's this kind of very weird balance to draw between the takeaway and actually all the caveats. I suspect that the approach to this needs to be radically different, or at least needs to be different when it comes to communicating this to a public that's not necessarily reviewer 1, 2, and 3 and the editor, and then the few people that read our papers. So I just love to hear what you have to say about how you manage this challenge, and what type of, what's your experience and what type of skills you have to develop to actually be able to reconcile the complexity of science with the demands of your particular job in communication?
Yeah, I think one of the things you become aware of is how strange you are as a result of having spent a long time in academia. You become really atypical in the taste that you develop for abstraction, which as soon as you step outside, you realize that that's not how most people operate or in how they communicate, right? They communicate in a much more sensory-based way. We've had years and years of abstractions, of learning to build theories, of learning to deal with concepts, and presumably also have a little bit of a natural attraction to that. This is, we're weird. Just accept that we're weird that way. And that's the starting point. And the second point, Andrea, that you raised is the taste for complexity. That, of course, gets honed and sharpened the further along you progress. So I think one of the most challenging things that I found myself doing when I began writing for non-scientific audiences is unlearning some of those habits. And I think of it almost like I actually grew up in sort of straddling a number of different cultures and languages. And to me, crossing over between academic worlds and, say, literary or journalistic worlds is very similar. I feel like I'm really operating in multiple different cultural environments and even using different languages. So sometimes when I start summarizing a body of work that I know very well, I find myself automatically kind of leaning on the kind of language that I've been programmed to use as an academic, and really needing to step out of that and very consciously try to do something different. So in a way, the longer you've spent in academia, I think the more challenging it is to recognize that how and why so much of the world does not relate to the way that you've been trained to speak. So it's very useful to spend a lot of time around people who are not scientists. I think that's been very helpful to me to observe when I talk about work that I think is interesting, to notice what interests them, and it's not always what I would expect. I see them perking up at things that I maybe took for granted or didn't think was that interesting. And I realized, like, oh, okay, this is not generally known. So yeah, widening your social circle, I think, is super, super helpful.
I would 100% agree with that. One of the core tenets of what we do with museums is that never design for yourself, right? Think about who your audience is, test what you're doing with your audience, and that's the feedback that will tell you whether you're successful. The nice thing about museums is that because we communicate across a range of different platforms, you have to think about, well, what are both the constraints and the opportunities that any one particular format affords you. So in an exhibit, for instance, like if you're writing a text panel, our word limit for any given text panel is like 70 words, right? So it really forces you to distill exactly what you want to say. And I probably rewrite that panel like 15 times, right, to get it down to exactly the bare bones. On the other hand, like, I've got my own virtual platform on Facebook Live to talk about epidemiology, and I can, it's more about the translation of the concepts rather than length. And so I can, be as creative as I want. And so thinking about who you're communicating for and what format you have, I think, is a way to figure out how to do it most effectively.
Yeah, and I would add to that too, to be really, really super aware of what your goal is. So when you're communicating within an academic setting, there's sort of an implicit goal that is common to most presentations and papers that you're going to read and write. But when you step outside of that, your goals are going to change dramatically. There's a huge variation of goals that you might have for your audience. In some cases, it might be as simple as sparking curiosity in some area that they didn't know existed. In other cases, you might want to persuade them to lean towards taking a particular action that's going to be good for them or good for public health. And I find that every time I sit down to write anything, whether it's a short piece or a book length piece of work, I kind of write out an image of who I think my reader is, as specific as possible, down to, what level of education they have, what are their hobbies, how do they spend their time, what format are they going to read this in. But I also think a lot about what my goals are for them. They have some goals, but they don't necessarily know enough about the field to have a very rich set of goals in approaching the work. So I try to formulate that in my mind and think really very, very precisely what I want them to take away from that piece of writing. And the range is just huge, much, much wider. And that's part of the fun, I think, of the enterprise, is that you get to write in different voices, you get to write for different audiences, and you're always kind of stepping into other people's minds as you're trying to maintain a connection with them, right? It's really, at the end of the day, it's all about connecting with your reader and with your audience. And that's very gratifying.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your insights. So we'll go back to the chat. There's a question from Naz Dikelil, sorry for the pronunciation, for Jayatri, that asks, what kind of skills and experiences do you think were crucial for you to be hired in your position? And to follow up, now that you have been at your position, what kind of skills are you relying on the most?
Sure. So, I think the challenge when you're transitioning out of academia is to show that you have skills that are applicable to the job that you're applying for, and not just that you're dissatisfied with academia and looking for anything else, right? So for me, I think what got me hired was that I had a portfolio of work to offer. I had developed educational programs. I had organized events. I had a portfolio of science writing that I had done. And so even though all of that I had done as a hobby, not intentionally, I was able to kind of just reframe my resume to really foreground those experiences that I had kind of been personally motivated to do on the side, to show that, look, I actually do have skills that will be valuable for what you need. And complementary to that, I think the fellowship that I did at the National Academy of Sciences at the Koshland Science Museum was kind of like that professional stamp, demonstrating that I had awareness of the skills needed in the museum field, and that the museum field was a professional thing. A lot of people who don't know about how museums work think that, oh, it's just, anybody can just go to work in a museum, but there is a whole knowledge base around that. And, that fellowship was kind of where I picked up that skill set. Since I've been there, I think the skills that I rely on the most are, communication skills, both oral and written. For my graduate, from being an academic, I would say the most important thing is being able to learn things very quickly. Obviously I don't know everything, but I know how to learn almost anything. And that's huge. And then being able to think strategically, and that really reflects back on some of what Julie, you were saying about kind of knowing, what is your goal, like what is the big picture of what I'm trying to accomplish, so that you can communicate in the right way.
Thanks. And I think, we can also hear what Julie has to say about this particular question, just to hear her perspective as well.
Well, I mean, I have a somewhat different experience. I didn't have to convince any one employer that I was qualified for something. I just kind of started doing work and finding outlets for it. So it was much more self-directed, and it's a very different kind of life, I think, in that your eggs are not all in one basket. So if you decide that a relationship with an editor at a magazine is not working, you're not necessarily bound to that. You can move on to other outlets. In the last few years, I've been spending a lot of time book writing, which is its own thing and very self-directed. So in a sense, you're really just looking for ways to grow your own skill set and find the places where that skill set will be applicable. one of the things I really love about the life I have now is the complete and utter freedom to pick up projects that just kind of I trip over and I decide are worth doing for their own sake. So, this doesn't necessarily even have to be in the realm of science communication. At this point, I've just started a new collaboration with a woman who recently arrived in Canada from Syria. And we're going to team up and we're going to write a series of dual language children's books in Arabic and English that focus on the experiences of refugees and immigrants. So this is something that I can do together with the more sciencey things that I do. And one of the things that I really enjoy about this life is that it's not limited to one thing. It's just open. It's very, very porous to these kinds of experiences and influences that push me in one direction or another. So yeah, it's less about, I think, I mean, at the end of the day, I do want to convince granting agencies who will help fund writing the books and agents and publishers and that sort of thing. But I always think of it in terms of the work first. And I have not, when I've put the work first, I've not really had difficulty then finding an audience for it. My experience has been that in the field of language and the mind, there's a huge appetite for really good, strong writing and communication about this field. I think we're in a shift, actually, where a lot of the writing in science and in my area has in the past been done by journalists from the outside who were trained in storytelling techniques, but not necessarily in science. So, the Malcolm Gladwell type of journalism. And I think we're shifting away from that in science writing. And now there's more and more of a trend of scientists who are really excellent writers coming to the fore. So in a way, the bar is being raised in both ways in terms of scientific expertise, but also in terms of writing skills. And I find that personally really exciting. I think it's kind of the start of something quite different from what we've seen in the past.
If I can just jump on that, to add one other perspective is I would 100% agree with you, Julie, is that one of the things that I love about my job is the flexibility. Mm-hmm. And, being at a museum is that sometimes there are institutional projects, like the brain exhibit is kind of what I was hired to do. But the great thing about museums is that it's all about sort of building community relationships. And so I do have a lot of freedom to, keep those institutional projects going, but also, develop these other projects that come along as they strike my interest, because of course the museum will, very rarely turn down money to do something. But the other piece that I didn't quite appreciate when I started my job, I was a little bit nervous about taking this job, and my husband was like, well, if you hate it, then quit. But I hope, but in the public facing role that I have, I found that, the longer that I've been in my position, the more sort of social capital I've built up in the community. And when we think about some of the challenges in science communication these days, like who the messenger is one of, the biggest things. And so, having built up a presence over, 15 years now as part of the Franklin Institute, I have relationships in Philadelphia that really elevate the impact of what I'm communicating.
Yeah, I think that's a hugely important issue, right? Is that sense of trust that you build up. And it's interesting because you've built it up in quite different ways than I have. You've built it up through direct contact with your community, which your position allows you. I work from this space here. Not a lot of people come in here. And in a way, it's very removed from day-to-day interactions with people. But where I think there's the potential for a real connection and impact is that writing is actually a very, very intimate thing, right? Especially if you kind of depart from a more traditional just reporting style of science writing. And I think some of the best science writing really allows the reader not just to learn about a field or to understand a set of facts or theories, but it's really an invitation to the reader to enter the mind of the scientist and experience what is it like to observe the world, having the skills and tools of observation that a scientist has. And that kind of almost embodied intimacy that the reader has with the scientist writer, I think is a way of building exactly that kind of trust. It's a different form of social capital that's done over tremendous distance often. But I think it's such a critical piece of science communication, is who is the messenger? And whether you're in a position like Gayatri or whether you're a writer, where you establish that who's the messenger through your voice, that's, I think, absolutely key to effective science communication.
Thanks. Before moving on to the chat, I kind of have a question that is, in a sense, relates to what both of you were saying. And so I would like to hear a bit more about the more practical aspects of the type of networking or the type of personal relationships that you have to establish to do the type of work you're doing. And I mean, I'm asking that with Julie's case, maybe more in mind as a self-employed person. So how do you go about, how do you start pitching things to others? Do you just cold email them? Did you have previous contacts? Did you have people that you knew before that help you kind of at least get started? So I guess, that's kind of what I would like to hear. And I guess the same question could apply to Gayatri, obviously changing whatever needs to be changed to the different type of domain. But yeah, something maybe a bit more practical about how you go about networking and how you build the type of relationship that allowed you to be in the position you're in now.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that's going to depend a lot on the kind of work that you do. So because so much of my work is book length stuff, that's by nature, I think, a little bit more solitary and not necessarily involving a huge network of contacts, which isn't to say that you wouldn't benefit from that, but just on a daily basis, I'm not interacting with a vast stable of editors, for instance. But many people do. So many people, especially at the beginnings of their science writing careers, will write for as many different outlets as they can, because at the outset, you never get offered, a regular column or anything like that. You're just pitching piece by piece by piece. I would say that the best way to establish a network is through the National Association of Science Writers. In order to join the association, you do have to submit, I think, 5 what they call clips, which can't be your own personal blogs. It has to be pieces that have been published by somebody else. So once you've accumulated at least 5 of those, then that will allow you to join this association. There's an annual conference you can attend. There's job ads that get posted. There's message boards and that kind of thing. And I think that's a very valuable tool for many people to get plugged into a network of writers and editors and contacts who might be useful to them, and who also will share some of the same struggles and challenges. Gayatri, you've obviously built a portfolio early on in your career, so maybe you could talk about that a little bit. Do you have any sense of where people might begin with that as a way to kind of get those 5 critical first clips?
Yeah, I think that I saw somebody, Heather posted a link earlier about, opportunities to start science writing. And that's exactly the kind of outlet that I was doing, is just looking for small opportunities. I happen to have a fellowship from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute that funded my graduate work. And this whole program kind of makes me laugh now because it sounds so quaint. It was called Ask a Scientist. And this existed before there was Google. So it was literally a website that had a text box where people could ask science questions. And then the Institute would just send those questions out to different fellows who could write articles in response. And that's kind of how I got my start in establishing some science writing. But to your point, I think there are so many, the landscape has really opened up for where you can find those opportunities compared to where it was 15 years ago.
Yeah, and many more opportunities for scientists. So one really good place to start for scientists is The Conversation,
Yep.
where they basically the way that they work is with scientists and researchers, you pitch your article, and then the editors are very used to working with people who maybe haven't transitioned from away from that academic language to a more journalistic style of writing, and they will actually help you shape your piece. So not only do you get the opportunity to publish a piece on a widely read platform, but you also get some editorial assistance from people who are very sympathetic and welcoming to that kind of contribution. I just realized I'm going to look on my bookshelf. There's a couple of really useful books on science writing. I'm just going to look for them on my bookshelf, and I'll let maybe Gayatri talk some more.
Sure. So one, in the vein of just like professional organizations to keep track of, the primary professional organization for science museums is called the Association of Science Technology Centers, ASTC.org. Again, they have an annual conference. There's also the American Alliance of Museums, which is not constrained only to science museums, all types of museums, but there are many things that museum culture has in common across different topical focuses. But for me, I think one of the biggest supports for my professional development has been the National Informal STEM Education Network. Put that in the chat as well. But that is really a community of practitioners, and I've now been part of the development of that network over the last 10 years or so. But one of the things in museums is that things kind of build on each other. And I think Julie was referring to that as well, is that you start with a project. I started with a project about nanotechnology with this group of people, and you get to work with them on one project and you realize each other's strengths. And so when the next project comes along, suddenly you're like, oh, well, these are the people that are that would be great to bring on board for this next project, and so on and so on. And I would say that, my experience has been very organic in that sense.
Yeah, so the books that I found, and I'll put them in the chat as well, if I get a chance. There's one called A Field Guide for Science Writers by Deborah Bloom et al., a very, very well-known science writer. And this one here, The Science Writer's Handbook, covers lots of practical things, but also craft-related things. Very useful book by a collection of science writers. So those are two really good resources that will help you get started. And they list more resources that you can access in these books.
Thank you. So let's take another look at the chat. So there's a question by Mara Cohen, who's not addressed at anyone in particular. So I think I'll just put it up there and see what both of you have to say. The question says, can you talk about what type of science communication jobs exist for people interested in focusing on communication with a specific group? For example, through a foundation like the Simon's Foundation and Autism. And also Mara followed up with asking, I would love to hear more about the National Academy of Science Foundation. So to the extent that these things can be talked about at once, we can talk about them, all of them at once. Otherwise, we can, split them up depending on how things go. But yeah, take it away.
I mean, I can chime in. I think what's really cool about working with a very focused audience is that they bring a lot of knowledge to the conversation, and you're starting that interaction at a different level. We've worked with one of the partnerships that we've had is with people who are part of the Brain Injury Association of Pennsylvania, and so they're very knowledgeable about the brain because they've had to be, but they bring that lived experience to the issue that not all scientists have had. And so I think there are really a lot of creative opportunities for working in collaboration with your audience when you have that kind of knowledgeable community who's involved.
Yeah, I don't really have a whole lot to add to that. So most of my science writing career has taken place from Canada, not necessarily within Canada, because I would say that the vast majority of my revenue streams are from the United States. But I'm less aware of some of the opportunities that exist, with specific associations in the US or the AAAS. So I'm not sure that I have a lot to add to that, other than that I know that these kinds of positions exist fairly widely. And of the people that I know who work in them, they've come, again, from a variety of different backgrounds, not even necessarily from the scientific background that's most directly relevant to those associations. I think in general, there's a very, very high value placed on the general skills of being able to communicate effectively, being able to absorb a body of literature quickly, and having an appreciation for accuracy. And anybody with an academic background basically has demonstrated those abilities. And presumably, if you're interested in applying for a job with an association, then you have some a motivation to transfer those general skills into that particular domain. And in my experience, people have really made quite significant leaps from their primary areas of expertise to the communication jobs that they're actually end up working in. So I think certainly right now, with the level of competition that exists, which is not super saturated within the field right now, there's a lot of room for movement across fields and into different domains, and you're not stuck working within the particular domain in which you're trained. But that's very much kind of an observer's observation, as opposed to any firsthand experience that I have. Yes, and I see in the chat, Heather's noted that universities themselves hire a number of science communication people. Yeah, absolutely, and that's another avenue. And in fact, your university communications people may be very helpful in helping you build up a portfolio of work as well. So if you have an office of media relations, for instance, and you're interested in thinking about what outlets are there that I could write for, talk to the people in these offices, and they themselves have a network of editors and outlets that they work with, and they might be able to help you place some pieces.
Thank you so much. We still have 15 minutes, right, Heather? Just correct me if I'm wrong. So I encourage, again, people to put their questions in the chat. In the meantime, I kind of want to follow up with a question that came out repeatedly in the previous panel. So I thought it would be really interesting to also ask it now. In a sense, a lot of things came up already that speak to it, but I kind of wanted to hear your perspective more directly. So if you went back to grad school, or if you were talking to someone who's either in grad school or just finished grad school, what type of practical advice would you give for a person who's interested in following the path that you followed?
Read. Read a lot, and not just in your field. And this is challenging when you're in academia, very challenging when you're in academia. And I think this is one of the things I talk about when I say that as an academic, I felt there was so little room for anything outside of that. But now, in my daily life, I read not just science writing, I read all genres, all kinds of writing. Very useful to see all kinds of nonfiction writing, because there's a lot of innovative techniques that you can pick up on, a lot of ideas about structure and style that you kind of absorb. And it also gives you a perspective of the world outside of academia. I think this is something that I just keep coming back to, is we are in a bubble as academics, and we don't realize the extent to which we're in a bubble, not just in terms of our knowledge base, but all kinds of cultural and social norms and assumptions as well. They don't necessarily apply out in the world. And if you have the opportunity to spend time outside of that bubble, super, super helpful.
I feel like there was like 50 things I wish I had known back then. I think one thing specific to museums is to try and learn about design. We're always focused on what we're communicating. We don't always think about how it is communicated. But I think one of the most rewarding things that I've learned from working at a museum is the opportunity to work with graphic designers, to think about how you present information, because there's so much psychology behind, how people absorb information from the way it's presented, that, I've learned so much from them. The other thing that I might, along that kind of same line, is when you're in, if you go to a museum, try and have like a meta experience of thinking about looking around you and like, why did they do this or why did they do that? Because what you see in designed spaces, and that's not just museums, but malls or theme parks or wherever you go into a designed space, to think about how it fits people's behavior, because ultimately our museum's mission is to inspire people. It is not to educate. And there's an important difference between that. And that's not satisfying for a lot of people. So I want to be upfront that there's no value judgment there. But our goal is to build people's positive relationships with science. And that requires a very different lens than just thinking about, this is the information I want to communicate.
Thank you. Yeah, Julie, you wanted to say something?
Well, I'm just seeing a question in the chat about whether science communication usually takes the form of writing, thinking about recruitment, fundraising, verbal communication, talking about science in a lay-friendly way. One of the things that question sparked in my mind is outside of museums, public libraries are often a source of great programs, often with a scientific bent. And this is another area where, potentially they're hiring, or potentially one could pitch an idea for a project. And these can be, any kind of domain, from a one-off lecture, evening type of thing, or a series, a set of classes. So, one thing that you might do is start looking at your local library, see what they offer, and talking to the librarians and seeing whether they would have interest. That's also a really great way to build a portfolio of work, right? That you don't necessarily need to be recruited by someone who comes and says, we need someone to go into a classroom to do X. If you have an idea for a fun type of activity that you might be able to do, schools, public libraries, outside of museums, or other places where you might be able to do that.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. One of the things that we think about is that there's kind of a Venn diagram between science communication and what we call public engagement with science. And a lot of public engagement happens, elsewhere in like libraries, like you said, Julie, but it's really about taking science to where people already are. So, I worked with a grad student, several years ago who, was going to school in a rural area. There wasn't a science museum, and she asked me for advice. I'm like, well, where do people go in your town? And she said, well, there's a farmer's market. And I'm like, well, that's where you can start. And so she started her science, her public engagement with science here by, setting up a table at the farmer's market and getting her fellow grad students to do science activities with kids. And now she works at a science museum, right? So again, just being creative about, finding people and bringing science to them.
Yeah, and finding sources of funding too. So not all of them come from places you would expect, right? So maybe your local library doesn't have the budget to run a particular program, but there might be all kinds of community-based funding streams that do, that might be very happy to fund something original and innovative. I get a significant source of my revenue stream from arts grants for writing about science. So it's not always necessarily the obvious places that you would look for funding.
Thank you. Heather has a question, and the question says, a lot of our community has pressure and deadlines to write papers, thesis, and I'm curious whether Julie has any tips for getting writing done. Set hours a day, turn off the internet, accountability partner. So yeah.
I have a whole workshop I teach about this, about how to get writing done. It's difficult. So one of the things I find is that it's probably the most cognitively demanding thing in my career that I ever do on a regular basis. I remember having had a concussion a number of years ago. I was able to teach classes 3 weeks later, but it was 4 months before I could get back to book writing. Just realizing like all the threads you have to keep in mind as you're writing. Do I have any tips? Lots and lots, and different things are gonna work for different people. I think many of them boil down to impose structure as much as you can. So if you've got a natural time of day that makes sense to write, a natural space that makes sense to write. We know people are responsive to their physical environment and cues. And so much of the difficulty of writing is building up that momentum, getting going, facing the blank page, getting the brain revved up to write. If you can do that with a routine, that's really helpful. One of my tricks is, this is something that I read that Ernest Hemingway did, is always leave your writing, like never write as much as you can for the day, write when you still know where you're going. And so I get to a point where I know where I'm going, but I stop and I make notes for the next day. And it's a little bit like parking downhill, right? You're not having to pick up the momentum to go. So a lot of my tricks have to do with just getting started and overcoming that sense of like, oh, how do I gather my thoughts and turn them into prose? And it's a shockingly difficult thing. You'd think, how hard can it be to put words on a page? And it's ridiculously hard, even for someone who's been doing it for many years.
Thank you. Javad, we want to add something to that. You're very much welcome to.
I will just say that I can only write like late at night.
I'm the opposite. No way. Yeah, but you have to find your most alert time, right? Because it is so demanding. So really try to save your most alert time for writing if you can.
But like no one's emailing me at 11 o'clock at night. My kids are in bed. So, that's the only time that, I can actually focus. I thought that Jessica has a question for me in terms of the compensation.
In a sense, in fact, since we're nearing the end, and that's a question that we basically, which we ended all the previous panels. So I think this question comes with perfect timing. So Jessica's asking, how's the compensation for scientists working for museums? What's a typical starting salary? Obviously, museums are not rolling in cash themselves. So I'm curious whether you can live comfortably on a salary from this career. And so I would just take the opportunity of turning this question into a larger question and just ask both of our panelists to tell us something more about ballpark average salaries or compensation or revenues, entry level, and then projected in the years that, from the type of work that they're doing. I think this would be a great time to bring up this type of consideration. So yeah, maybe Jayasri, you want to start since the question was for you, but I would really like to hear both of you.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, as I mentioned that, there's not a huge market for PhD scientists at museums. And I have largely been at one museum my entire career, so I don't have a very, sort of field-wide estimate. But I would say that like a starting salary for a PhD level scientist at the Franklin Institute now would probably be in the high 60s. So it's not, listening to the tail end of the previous session, I'm like, yeah, that's not us. And just, to be completely transparent, museums, were hit hard as an economic sector during the pandemic. Our entire staff was cut by about 3/4, and the rest of us all took pay cuts of anywhere from 10 to 30%. We are starting to recover now, but we are science centers in particular among museums are a very sort of ticket driven business for the most part. There are some who get government funding, but for us, like 60% of our annual revenue comes from ticket sales. So we're very sensitive to changes in the economy. So that's sort of the business side of what we do.
I mean, if you're talking about freelance writing and science communication work, it's obviously massively variable. depending on the kind of work you do, how much of it you want to do, how quickly you do it. So just to give you an idea, I consistently have been, since leaving academia, topping out at about 2/3 of my academic salary, which I feel, I mean, I'm very fortunate that that's manageable. One of the reasons that gets manageable as if you're a freelancer is you can work from anywhere. So you have much more geographic control. So this can massively reduce your cost of living, which it has done in my case. You certainly could earn more in many different careers. I think the reason to do the kind of work, if you're thinking about freelancing, the reason to do that is because of the incredible freedoms that you gain. So I see a lot of people benefiting from this if they're, for example, in conjunction with a partner who has geographic constraints and they're able to follow that partner around. I know a writer and editor who has followed his partner all over the world. She's in the diplomatic corps and he just picks up and, continues his work from wherever they happen to be. It's a great thing for mixing with family responsibilities. Travel if you want to. I really love not being tied down to an academic term and being able to spend 3 months in the Czech Republic if I want to. Last year, my brother was dying of pancreatic cancer and I was able to just go and be with him for a few weeks at the end of his life. These kinds of things are priceless as far as I'm concerned. So if you can manage to make it work within your context, I think that there are rewards, that offset some of the obvious financial costs.
I think that's right. 100% that, I so appreciate the fact that the work that I do has direct impact on people, and that I can be proud of who my whole self is in all aspects of my life. I don't, I do work at work and and not at home, but who I am is who I am across, all parts of my life, and that has been important to me.
Yeah, I would resonate with that, Gayatri. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's 4:30, so we unfortunately are out of time for this panel and for the day. So I just want to thank both of you for the incredibly insightful discussion and for sharing your thoughts and tips and experiences. That's been extremely informative to me, and I think to everyone who attended. Yeah, so I think I'll just turn it over to Heather to see if there's any last minute announcements or communication, but thanks again. And yeah, that's been a great day for me at least, and I think for everyone else. So thanks.
Yeah, so we actually do